All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Janet Doan. I'm the Admissions Outreach Coordinator here at Keck Graduate Institute. Welcome to our summer speaker series. We're really excited to have you all here today. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here and to listen to our speakers. So today we have Kevin O'Connor. He graduated from Keck Graduate Institute from our Master's of Business and Science program in 2017. He is currently the Corporate Development Manager at Jazz Pharmaceuticals. He will be speaking on business development, operations, supply chain, and we also have our faculty moderator, Dr. Steve Casper, here with us today. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I'm actually going to turn it over to Dr. Casper.
All right, so hey everybody. So I'm gonna place Kevin here front and center. If you don't see my ugly face, you can see Kevin instead. Here he is. Hey, so we're gonna ask questions. I have some regular questions for like the first 20 minutes or so. Then we should have time for a Q&A from you in the audience at the end. We also have some live people here at KGI. Kevin actually is here at KGI today. So why don't you tell everybody about your background a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, hello everyone. Thanks for joining today. I've been looking forward to this. I guess a bit about my background. I started off like I would imagine many of you studying some sort of hard science discipline back in undergraduate. And really enjoyed that. But through a number of experiences, determined that I think my passion and my skills really had potential somewhere in the business aspect of the life sciences business that I really did have that passion for. So, through various means, I learned about KGI here in Southern California, and I came out to learn about it. Dr. Joel West was pretty instrumental in convincing me to come out here. So thanks, Joel. I owe a lot to you. And here's where I really, was able to build on my foundation of what was biochemistry and molecular biology and medicinal chemistry from undergrad to really build on top of that with a business acumen, if you will, and an understanding of the life science specifics that a business leader needs to succeed. So I was in the MBS program, as Dr. Casper mentioned, and was also, if you still have majors here, I was a business of bioscience major concentration. Went through the general curriculum. Again, Joel West, had to give him a lot of credit for introducing me to consulting, because at the time I knew I wanted to be in the business of bioscience, but didn't exactly know where I wanted to specialize in that. And so I entered the consulting club here at Jazz. I'm sorry, not at Jazz. Here at, you can tell I work at Jazz now. Here at KGI, ended up, taking a leadership position in the consulting club as well. And that really helped me not only get a really great internship, which KGI is really set up well to do for their students, but also then get a real nice job coming out of KGI at what was formerly known as Promethean Consulting. So from there, I spent about 5 years in the consulting business, working my way up from associate up to associate principal, when I finally decided that I wanted to kind of double down my efforts and really focus in on what I now knew was what I wanted to be my specialty, which was really business development, corporate development, in the sense that I could work with a talented team to build something great, not only for the business, but most importantly for patients, and really make a difference there in that industry that so many years ago I knew I wanted to get into. So as Casper mentioned, now a manager of corporate development at Jazz Pharmaceuticals. I'm really enjoying it.
Tell us a little bit about Jazz Pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, so those of you that don't know, Jazz Pharmaceuticals is what a lot of people would call a specialty pharmaceutical company, and we specialize in oncology products as well as neuroscience products. And the term specialty pharmaceutical company kind of refers to a company that is more focused on the development of drugs as well as the commercialization and management of those drugs versus the basic biological research that of course precedes those two steps. And so at Jazz, we do a lot of work to really drive the core of our business to evaluate what we call external innovation. In other words, working with smaller biotech companies, sometimes academic spinouts, and in other cases, even professors at university, to really look for the diamonds in the rough, as we call it, to see what technologies, therapies, new approaches, and even laboratory practices that we could begin to think about building together into a business that will maximize the value for patients and the product overall. And then at that point, if we find something that we do like, us in the corporate development team work with our cross-functional partners to essentially cook up a deal and see how we could partner with those external innovators to maximize that value and bring that drug into Jazz.
Mm-hmm. And talk about your current role a bit more in business development.
So in my current role, let me get into some specifics of it. In my current role in corporate development, my core team, which is called corporate development, is really a small group of business and financially minded individuals who all have a background in some sort of life science, right? And we partner with a couple of other teams that specialize in particular functional areas along the value chain, if you will, for pharmaceutical products. So we have one team that we work with called search and evaluation. And before I go into this, let me preface this by saying that all of these functions that I'm about to describe are really under the umbrella of business development. The team I work in specifically is more on the financial contracting sides of things, but we of course leverage experts from a number of other disciplines to really pull together a cohesive and comprehensive business thesis that will then drive our transactions moving forward. So going back to those teams, we work with one team called Search and Evaluation. And this is essentially a team of PhD scientists, medical doctors, and specialty researchers that we really leverage. We leverage their expertise to evaluate the technologies from the most detailed technical level to really understand, is this a differentiated technology and will this provide value to the patients and to the market? There's another team that we call New Product Planning, and they're essentially our internal commercial team, very similar to consultants in a way, where if there is a technology that the research team really finds promising, we'll turn to the commercial team and say, hey, commercial team, what would it take to commercialize a product like this in terms of cost, selling and general administrative expenses, et cetera, and what potential returns could we see on the market to then fund that investment in the development? And so they'll do a whole workup in terms of how of essentially the dollars that Jazz would have to lay out to develop a product, as well as the dollars you might expect to get back in terms of that investment. We also have a number of other teams that I won't go into in as much detail, but we have a team that focuses on commercial manufacturing, or CMC, as well as teams that focus on, of course, medical affairs, market access, et cetera. And us in the corporate development team are really leveraging the expertise from all of those individual functions to pull together what we kind of refer to as the book report, the business case. I'm sure current KGI students are very familiar with those business cases, to say, hey, look, we had this idea, we've worked with these experts, we've pulled together this full story beginning to end of why this will work, why we think it's good for Jazz, and why we think this will be good for patients as well as our shareholders. And then from that point, what we do is, we move forward to get certain levels of authorization from our executive committee to then make a bid on those potential transactions. From that point, there's a negotiation process, and once you align on a certain set of high-level terms, then you move to a contracting process, which frankly is probably the longest and most boring process in this overall effort. But that's really where the details come in, and that's where you make the magic happen to get a deal done, which again, the whole idea is to find these innovative technologies to improve the lives of patients.
That's an awesome answer. And go into a bit more on what you actually do on these teams. What's your day-to-day like?
So my day-to-day, I am responsible for, well, let me give you an analogy. We use two analogies a lot. One is that the corp dev team acts as the quarterback for those various expert teams.
Yep.
The second analogy is that we consider all of those expert teams as writing a chapter, if you will, in a book. And then we in the corp dev team pull a book report together, which is then used to communicate the concept of that business case broadly to the organization to get buy-in. And of course, ultimately, you need your CEO to be behind any transaction that we're going to be doing. Okay, so from a day-to-day basis, I'm working with a number of cross-functional partners to gather their expertise, to ask the right questions, to ensure that we're building that story in the best possible way. And on top of that, we in the corp dev team are sitting behind the scenes to put together a pretty extensive financial model. So that those KGI students, again, that are taking financial modeling, I believe it's corporate finance and management here.
And stuff like that, yeah.
And there's also some really great classes over at Drucker. There's still that partnership there to really help you, begin to pull all the data together into something that ultimately spits out a data-driven answer of whether or not this makes sense, whether or not it's a good investment for patients and shareholders. From that point, once we find something that does make sense, the corp dev team, myself and my team, we'll go through the process of interacting directly with these external stakeholders, that the innovators, if you will, whether that's the CEO of some biotech out there or some academic professor, to, in short, determine what a partnership could look like and how we could work together to create a win-win business scenario in which we have access to promising external innovation while also rewarding success to the innovators. And that kind of gets into a lot of these bio-buck deal structures, if you've heard that term, in which there's often some sort of upfront payment to enter a collaboration along with success milestones along the way. Should the product or technology become commercialized and earn a revenue, then there's generally sales milestones and or royalties attached to that as well. And so in that way, you're able to enter a partnership that both shares the risk and also the reward between both parties.
Makes sense. Can we, a little broader, Jazz is known as this really successful company. What about the culture of this company helps drive success? Can you describe the culture of what it's like working there and kind of how that impacts how decisions are made or people work together?
Yeah, I think, Jazz is not unique in the sense that we really put patients first in a lot of things and use that to drive our efforts in the search for external innovation, as well as the evaluation of that, to really find things that are meaningful to patients. There are companies out there that look for biosimilars, Me Too products, reformulations of generics, but at Jazz, we're really looking for true innovation, and to be specific, new chemical entities that will really move the needle for patients and providers in terms of improving the quality of life or extending the life of the patient. So I think that core mission, if you will, that's probably what our corporate decks call it, our core mission, really helps focus us on what we need to do on a day-to-day basis. And I would say beyond that, what I find quite striking within our team is the amount of trust in our cross-functional teams, as well as just the trust that they are the experts in their particular area, right? And by no one necessarily standing up and saying, I know better than you, I know all of this better than these individual groups, we're able to develop a very collaborative culture where we can work together, speak honestly, speak our truth about things, to ultimately, get to the bottom of what the value could be. As opposed to, I don't know, playing to politics, if you will. I think it's very important to be, brutally honest, very transparent in a lot of ways in our evaluations, because if not, oftentimes that just wastes time. And it might provide something that's not as meaningful. And there's always an opportunity cost when you think of that from an investing standpoint.
It's got to be tricky though, because even if you have the best analysis possible, a lot of these projects are going to fail just because biotech, they fail all the time because of the science.
Yeah.
So how do you avoid that, making that not like a blame game and just realizing the process was good? We made a good decision and it didn't work out.
That's a great question. Yeah. I think that's something that really comes down from the very highest levels of leadership at a company like Jazz. Again, I don't think Jazz is necessarily unique in this way, but companies that are successful in biotech, that are investing in high risk, high reward research, you have to know that most bets will fail. 9 out of 10, maybe 19 out of 20 of those bets will fail. And so having a culture that's coming down basically from the CEO that says, hey, look, we are willing to make bets, as long as the risk and the reward are structured appropriately to be shared among the partners. We want and we need to make those bets. There's also a culture of failing quickly, and so and that's a pretty common term out in business, not only in biotech but other fields of technology. You have to try a lot of things, and sometimes you run into a wall and you say, hey, okay, that's it. Let's move our focus elsewhere to something that has a higher, what we call, probability of technical or regulatory success. That said, we don't focus too much on the probability of technical or regulatory success, because even if something fails, we still learn, we still win. And by and large, if you want to look at it from a holistic standpoint, the market and the broader scientific community has learned something, and we've contributed to our overall mission, even when a product fails to reach its goal. Yeah.
Is there a part of your job that you find most challenging or stressful, or you really like, okay, this is going to be tough today? And how do you deal with that? And because there's always easy and there's always hard. I learned that over the years.
Well, specifically for me, the most aggravating part of the deal process is contracting. I don't have a law background. I've learned a lot, and they're not quite as complicated as you think, but you sit down with a 100-page contract for $100-200 billion deal, whatever it might be, and all those tiny little details sure start to become very important, and so that becomes a very laborious part of the process, which, again, as I mentioned, probably the longest and most boring part of this entire effort. But that is really the magic that makes these deals work. It makes them work for us, makes them work for our partners, as well as for the patients.
Yeah. So I've been really impressed just listening to you. Clearly you're a hardcore business guy at the company, but the technology, the science, the industry dynamics seem really important. How did KGI help you in terms of getting prepared for this type of job?
Well, it's a great question. So, as I've mentioned a couple of times here, sitting in corporate development, we're not necessarily the process experts in any one individual discipline other than finance and contracting, right? And so we need to work with all of our cross-functional partners and be able to know enough to be dangerous, right? To use that term, to ask the right questions, to challenge them, and pressure test their thinking when that's necessary. So that becomes very important. And what KGI did for me, and part of the reason I came to KGI, is that the curriculum is quite broad, right? So here at KGI, you develop a keen understanding of the science that hopefully builds upon your undergraduate degree if you studied science. But not only that, you also learn how science is done in the industry, right? Outside of an academic laboratory, how drugs are developed through preclinical processes, how they're discovered, and how they're developed through clinical trials. On top of that, you have to understand the regulatory landscape and all the hurdles that you may face along the way, things that you need to be prepared for. And there's certainly this element of just understanding, the broad, I want to say regulatory environment, but just the restrictions that we work in as a drug company in the United States, ensuring that you understand the boundaries of activity where you can go. And that really helps helps you understand how to navigate that path to success, right? So memories are flashing back now. I think about the regulatory science class. At the time, I was like, I'm not going to be a regulatory scientist, but boy, is that important now, right? I'm thinking back to Dr. Neem's class, if she's still here.
Still here,
understanding the process to get a product commercialized, what high throughput screening is, various types of laboratory assays that produce the data that we will rely on to make a business decision. And having, I'm certainly not an expert, but being able to, be at those tables and understand what people are talking about to be able to pull that story together has been invaluable to me. Not necessarily related to Jazz, but prior to my opportunity at Jazz in consulting, it was very similar. As a consultant, you work on a number of different therapeutic areas, therapeutic modalities, different business questions, and having a broad background to at least, be able to understand the business
Yeah,
question before you get into the nitty gritty details, which you
Could
can
be my
teach
next
yourself.
question. Yeah.
It's critical. So it's just like, for example, it'd be very difficult to read one of the latest papers on molecular biology if you didn't first take an overview class in molecular biology, to lay that foundation. If you just expand that scope out without being able to take a broad curriculum here at KGI, which is really what the MBS program does, it's difficult to know exactly where you want to go within that. And it's also difficult to work with cross-functional partners, which I believe is really critical in this business, because there's no one part of the business that operates in a silo.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you a little bit more. Dr. West has done a brilliant job in really expanding the ability of our students to get consulting jobs. Last year, I don't know, you can tell us, Joe, I think it was at least 15, 20 students got consulting jobs at the end. And I've noticed that seems to be the gateway to a lot of the business development jobs. Can you talk about that career path a little bit? Why consulting again is?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm a big proponent of consulting, especially early in your career. Unless you're one of these unique people that knows exactly what you want to do, I envy you, and go ahead and do that. But many of us don't exactly know what we want to do, for the rest of our lives, if you will. And so consulting not only gives you an opportunity to try out a bunch of different skills, to experience different types of companies, different technologies at different stages of their development, whether that's preclinical, clinical, or commercial phase products, work across different therapeutic areas, et cetera. But perhaps even more importantly, it gives you an opportunity to learn all these variety of skills, right? And that's probably what helped me the most getting into something like corporate development, is building upon that kind of broad foundation that KGI gave me to go maybe an inch deeper across all of those things with consulting, and develop that real world experience that created what I like to think is a well-rounded experience for myself, which has set me up quite well, in my opinion, to work in corporate development, where again, you're really working across multiple functions, and you need to be able to communicate and understand with all those to pull that together into an overall business thesis.
Yeah, it makes sense. Well, we're going to open it up for Q&A in just a minute. Let me ask you one more. This always comes up. What advice would you? So we have like 90 undergrads here, and they're all going to go do amazing things.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize they're all undergrads.
They're mostly undergrads.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, great. Go to KGI.
Yeah, we're good. And that was Kevin O'Connor. No, anyway. No, we're good. What advice though would you give to these guys in terms of just thinking about, because it's just so stressful. I have a daughter that's an undergrad right now, and just trying to figure out what you want to do with your life, and there's 50 people telling you different things. What worked for you, and what advice would you give them from where you are now as a very successful business person?
Well, I would say I stressed a lot about what I was going to do, especially when I was most of your ages. I knew I wanted to be in the life sciences. I knew I had this passion for science, but I made the personal realization that I didn't necessarily want to be in a laboratory or be in a hospital, for example. And that left me with some anxiety of what do I do? What's the future ahead for me? And I guess to sum that up, say, relax. You don't necessarily need a 5, 10, 15-year plan like some employers might, encourage you to to share with them. If you find something that you like, generally walk in that direction. Put your head down, put in hard work, even if it's something, if there's a particular class that's not your favorite, still give it your all, because you never know what might come of that skill, of that knowledge that you're picking up there. And generally, opportunities will present themselves along the way. And I would just say, go into life as well as your academic and then your future professional career with an open mind, and not necessarily be a yes man and take any opportunity that comes your way. But, I think I read a stat once that approximately 70 people in professional careers ended up there, not necessarily by chance, but they never planned to be there. And it's a very, very fulfilling career to them. If you asked them, would you do something different? They would say no. And you asked them, did you plan to be here? They'd say no. And so I guess that's just a long way of saying, if you like science, if you like life sciences, if you like the the medical industry, just walk in that direction and do your best to learn everything that you can. And on top of that, talk to people, because there's a lot of people out there that were in your same position not that long ago. I'm one of those people, and they're often more than willing to share their experience to help you shape your own ideas of where you want to go. And so, I mean, I can say I probably talk, I can't even count the number of people that I just pestered for informational interviews to say, hey, what was your plan? Or most of them didn't have a plan. What was your path? How did you get there? What were the key catalysts? And, what would you change? Or, what would you really recommend doubling down on? And I think that's incredibly valuable for folks at your age to just keep an open mind and, try to capture as many perspectives as you can along the way to help shape your developing perspective. But don't be too stressed about what exactly that plan is, that North Star out there.
Yes, so, with you in that 100%.
Yeah.
But informational interviews, internships, summer
absolutely
programs,
experiences.
Experiences. I'm with you on that.
100%.
All righty. So what I can talk all day, but why don't we see if the audience here have any questions for Kevin here? So if you have any questions, put them in chat. Kevin, can you give us some examples of what sort of tasks or projects you liked as a consultant and some that you decided you were not a good fit for? You can do that.
Sure. Yeah. So, that's for me from a consulting perspective. I did a number of projects in commercial strategy, and more specifically launch strategy that I found very, very interesting. And launch strategy is essentially the process of thinking through what you are going to do with a drug candidate once it becomes reasonably likely for that to reach the market. Oftentimes, a company will push a product through preclinical, through phase 1, and start getting through phase 2 before they really believe that the probability of technical success has increased to a point where they say, okay, we're going to invest in setting up this business, figuring out how to prepare the market to be ready for this drug so that it can be quickly, efficiently delivered to patients to fulfill its potential. So I really enjoyed that process, and I think that overall helped me set me up for my career now. And just in the sense that you have to not only understand the differentiation of the drug and its potential from a medical standpoint, but then say, okay, how are we going to manufacture this drug? How are we going to distribute the drug? How are we going to work with insurance companies and payers to see the value in this drug and to reimburse it for patients? How are we going to communicate to physicians the value of this drug and hopefully convince them to use it for their patients as well? And so there's, again, a very cross-functional analysis of how to set up a business for a drug to be, if you will. So really enjoyed that. Some things I didn't enjoy as much were producing routine reports. So there's a certain there's a study called an ATU, which is a awareness, trial, and usage study that businesses really rely on heavily to make business decisions for inline products, meaning products that are already on the market. And they'll run a study every 6 months, if you will, to essentially survey the market to see who's aware of the drug, how they're using it, and what they might need to be convinced to use it more. And it's kind of a routine process of sending out surveys, talking to KOLs, and updating a report over and over that isn't particularly interesting. So, I mean, I guess if I step back and look at those two examples, consulting was really, really fun for me when there was this big open question of how do we launch this drug, right? And it was even more interesting when it was a really innovative drug. For example, I worked with CAR T therapies for a while. It's a brand new drug, never been on the market before, cellular therapy, quite complex. It was a fascinating project. Doing an ATU for like a nasal spray, perhaps not so interesting.
It pays the bills.
It pays the bills though, it does. And hey, I was probably a lot less stressed during those times and had a little more free time on my hands, so that's fine, kind of give and take.
So let's see. So students, this is your chance. Put it in chat if you have a question. So Rome has one. How important is the CV in your field? If so, can you give examples of how to do a good one?
I mean, I generally think CVs are quite important. I think, it's a matter of first impressions. The CV is what gets you in the door. I'll say that. Once you get an interview or you get on the phone with someone, from that point on, the CV is not as important, right? What it is your ability to present yourself, your ability, to communicate well, and also just to display your level of expertise and mastery in whatever discipline that you're going for when you've submitted that CV. In terms of a CV structure, we actually focused a lot on this in the consulting club back in the day. But I mean, just a couple of key things to point out. I would say generally, and unless you're applying for a scientific position and you're going to list off a number of research methods and publications, et cetera, keep your resume to one page. Keep it to one page. Try to be as brief as possible while still communicating, your talents and your expertise. You can think of the resume as almost being an example of how you will perform in your job, right? If your CV is 10 pages long, then your future employer can expect emails that are 5 pages long. They probably don't want that. I see Joel nodding his head. We've talked about this before. If they see a CV that has funky formatting, that's not efficient, and it doesn't look like you know how to use Microsoft Word, they might think to themselves, well, how are we going to have this person write a report for us if they can't even make a one-page resume in Word, right? So it begins to reflect, it's not just about what's said there, but how it's presented that speaks a lot about how you will operate in the workplace. So keep it short, keep it brief, use high impact language, use parallel structure in your wording, clean formatting, and certainly no spelling errors, grammatical errors. Like, I shouldn't have to say that, but what I would strongly recommend, develop your one-page CV or resume, and share it with friends and family. See if they can find things with it. Encourage them to be brutally honest of how you could improve that. Furthermore, if you have contacts in the industry, you can always, you can reach out and very politely say, hey, look, I'm looking for a job, not necessarily with you, but I wonder if you could help me out, really frame this up right. And oftentimes people will be willing to give you a little advice along the way.
Okay, so we got a bunch of good student questions now. This one just came in, but how about work-life balance? I think you're married.
I am married.
That helps. There you go.
Yes.
Work-life balance. How does that work for you?
I mean, for those that are familiar with this industry, if you think about consulting versus industry, consulting is certainly an area where you tend to work a greater number of hours than you do in an industry job.
There are crunch times.
There are crunch, yes, exactly. But I will say that there are crunch times in my job as well.
Yeah.
In consulting, you should be prepared to work, 40 to 60 hours a week, where 45, 50 is probably standard, and during crunch time 60, maybe even 70 hours a week. But generally it's not as bad as it sounds, because you're working with a talented team of individuals doing something that's high impact. On the industry side, for me, I usually count on about a 40-hour week, with a lot of flexibility. Like, for example, I'm here with you all today, right in the middle of a Thursday. But there are certainly times as well where the team is banding together to meet some sort of deadline, and really make something happen. What I will say is that a difference between industry and consulting is that in industry, we're setting our own deadlines for the most part. In consulting, you've been hired to produce a product by a deadline set by a client, and that often is what results in the in a slightly longer hours in a lot of cases.
Yeah, if you don't do a good job, you're not going to get into the project either.
Right.
So yeah, that's a great answer on that. How about this one here by Katie? What do you tell scientists at Jazz after things go bad and experiments fail? You might be telling them, but how does the company deal with failure? You talked a little bit about this before.
Well, I mean, let's see.
It's interesting in science, right? Because so much of it does fail.
Yeah. I don't know if I'd use the word fail. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of times it just doesn't produce the data perhaps that we were hoping for, right?
Yeah.
And in those cases, you pivot. Sometimes you can reposition a product. Like, for example, if we're testing a product in epilepsy, for example, that's not showing too much activity there in epilepsy, well, maybe it'll work in PTSD, maybe it'll work in bipolar, and maybe those aren't good examples. I'm not that much of a scientist myself anymore, but they're always looking, if there's a compound with biological activity and doesn't work one indication, you can pivot to something else. The other thing I would say is that failing quickly in science is a good thing.
Yeah.
Leadership appreciates that. And the reason is, if you fail way later on, you've still failed. You've just invested a lot more time and money along the way. Yeah. So it's actually probably appreciated in a way if you can early on set up a good experiment that would hopefully show a proof of concept, and it doesn't, because that means we're going to say, okay, let's stop right there. Let's turn our time and our money somewhere else to hopefully have a greater impact and a greater level of success.
Awesome answer to that. One from Harvey here. I think I got that right. No, is it? Avni, my glasses. I need new glasses. Avni, talk about the challenges pivoting from like an academic kind of role to an industry role, and more broadly, what should be focused on as like a new person in an organization.
That's interesting. I mean, look, I think generally our industry on the whole is quite academic in the way that things are approached. When it's
research,
it's research at the end of the day. Most of the people that I interact with, have an undergraduate degree in sciences, and in our core, we're looking for data-driven decisions. We're looking for correlations. We're looking, at data, whether that's business data or biological data, experimental data, et cetera, to really drive things. I think perhaps the one thing that's quite important, and Joel and I have talked about this a lot, is and before I say that, it's not scientists going into business, it's anyone going into the professional world, no matter what background you come from, is you have to develop a level of emotional intelligence to be able to work with a broad range of individuals, different personalities with different incentives and motivations, to ultimately get your job done and to work with the team to get the overall mission completed. So I would say emotional intelligence is probably what I would say is the key success factor for folks in business.
Great. Maria here is dollars and cents. How much revenue does the company make? And then is the consulting position more lucrative than being a researcher or working at a company, I guess?
Jazz, I believe we top line revenue was just north of $3 billion in 2021. Pretty impressive. Yeah, it's not bad. I wish our stock price would reflect that a little bit more, but hey, that's a personal problem. I can't speak too much about the difference between consulting and a researcher, because it might depend on what type of researcher you're referring to. I would generally say that like an entry level consultant versus entry level like laboratory bench research position, a consultant will probably be compensated higher. That said, you might work longer hours. Yeah, kind of comes with the territory. But I don't really have a perspective to know about the income, or the salary projections for like a biological researcher, for example.
I think we can say very, very broadly that industry pays more than academia. You have a bit more freedom in academia. It's more individualistic a lot of the time, or industry, it's very team oriented and it's very goal oriented, and it is corporate at the end of the day. So sometimes a lot of people I've met, it's a personality thing on that. Yep. But if you like working on teams, go to industry, right? Because it's super team based.
It's very team based. Absolutely. Absolutely. Can't do anything without a team in this business.
And Beatrice has a good, she's just sitting right over here, wrote one. Just talk about like the skills you draw upon, what percentage are finance, technical, other things.
That's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question. Because at this point, a lot of it just kind of meshes together. But I would say I spend, on an average day, probably about 20% on the technical side of things, evaluating technologies and the data they produce to try to get a sense of whether we like it or not. I probably spend another 30% thinking about the financial implications of things, what it would you might expect. Does that make sense?
And that would be looking at models and so forth.
Generally, I spend a good amount of time in Excel, and I love that. I love math, so that's good. That other probably the biggest skill, 40%, is really people management, and understanding what other people are doing, how I can leverage their expertise in things, and it's also not just all of my requests, but also responding to things that they need to be sure that we're good partners internally as well.
And those people skills, I mean, you're a affable person, we all know, but super important, being able to get along with people, right?
Very, very important. Yeah. And boy, if you can get along with someone, you'd be surprised at how much easier it is to get what you need from a business perspective from that. Everyone's dealing with competing priorities all the time. You very rarely just have a whole team working on one project. Usually it's a whole team and you're all working on a different web of projects, right? So there is a certain amount of politics that you kind of have to think about, to ensure that you're getting the attention that you need for whatever is probably most important on your plate at that time. And so I would say, the last chunk, I forget how much percentage I have left, is just, keeping track. And this is important for corporate development, is keeping track of the market. What are other companies doing? What are they investing in? What are our competitors doing? How is the FDA changing their regulatory review processes? Not only to try to remain competitive, but just to remain informed for when the next opportunity does come along. You know what's going on, right? You can learn a lot from examples. So back when I was at KGI, they told me, hey, get a Fierce Biotech.
So I just yesterday I told somebody that.
Love Fierce Biotech. The previous editor of that started a new one called Endpoints, which is really good. I probably use Endpoints more now, but just staying abreast of the news in the industry is probably one of the best ways to learn, frankly.
Yeah, awesome. Let's do just a couple more. I think we've got Joel is sending me messages saying we're late. So if you guys have to go, take off, no problem at all. We really want to thank Kevin. Then one student asked a really good question though about the importance of your internship, both at KGI and I think when you answer that one real quick.
I mean, I might be a unique case, but my internship was extremely valuable for two reasons. I had an internship with a particular type of consulting company, and one thing I learned was I don't want to do that kind of consulting. So that was one thing. So I went a different direction with the consulting, and that greatly improved the quality of my life. Second to it was that when I went from my internship, I had a good consulting internship, and I went to apply for consulting jobs. There was very, very little scrutiny on my skills and my ability, because they basically looked at my internship and they said, hey, you got into that internship and you did well there, so we don't need to worry so much about all the nitty gritty details. We just want to make sure that you're a cool person to work with. And that was the bulk of my interview process. So again, similar to how your CV reflects upon you, your internship really shows your level of ambition, your ability to convince others of your skills, and hopefully you do well and you can get letters of recommendation from that as well. And that can almost get you past certain stage gates on its own in the interview process. So I would very, very strongly recommend to KGI students or students that go elsewhere to really focus on getting a good internship.
I would say 1, 2, and 3 to get it great. Summers are crucial. I worked at Knott's Berry Farm in the summer. It didn't help me get my job as a professor, I can tell you that. So get a job as an intern for sure. All righty, let's wrap it up there. Thanks, Joel. Joel set this up. Thank you, Joel. Thanks, Janet. And students, hope you really enjoyed that. That was awesome, Kevin. Thanks so much for driving down here.
My pleasure.
Really appreciate it. Okay.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you everyone for being here. I just want to set out a reminder that we'll also be having a summer speaker series webinar tomorrow as well with Rebecca Shell, the senior manager of Region X Bio. But if you have any questions or want to chat, please feel free to email me. My email's in the chat. Really appreciate you all for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your week and good luck this summer, and let me know if there's anything else. Thank you, Dr. Casper, for everything. Thank you, Dr. West, for everything. And thank you, Kevin, for being here. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.
All righty.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay. So now we go.